Have you ever been really afraid? I mean, had a giant in your life that was so big and so powerful and so overwhelming that it has you back on your heels, scared, afraid, has you on the run? We've all been there. Well, I want you to know that God wants us to overcome those kinds of fears in our lives. And to understand how God wants us to learn to overcome those fears, I want us to take a look at the life of a man by the name of David. He was a man who came out of nowhere to become a great military leader, a world-class poet, and a heartbroken father. But most of all, he was an overcomer. He overcame every challenge and every adversity that life threw his way. He became the ultimate overcomer. So I want us to look at how to overcome giants in our lives. And I know of no better place to begin the story of David than with David and Goliath and a valley. The Valley of Elah was named for its giant Elah trees. That's a type of oak tree that grew in the valley. The valley is about a mile wide. It's barren, it's stark, it's desolate, it's filled with stones and rocks. It's located in the heart of Palestine. It is a critical corridor between the Mediterranean Sea on the west and the high country of Judea to the east. It is of high strategic importance. You hold the Valley of Elah, and you hold the key to all of Palestine. That's why the valley has been the scene of epic battles throughout history. In 1187, the Muslims defeated Richard I, the Lionhearted, the Crusader, and sent him back to England with his tail between his legs. But here we find 2,000 years earlier, around 1000 BCE, the Philistines square off against the fledgling nation of Israel for control of this valley. Israel holds the northern ridge, the Philistines hold the southern ridge. Let me read to you a passage from 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning at verse 8, written by the prophet Samuel as he describes this great confrontation. He writes, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." The terms of the engagement are remarkably simple. When two armies reach a stalemate, they settle the conflict in hand-to-hand combat. Your best champion against our greatest warrior. Champion to champion, toe-to-toe, winner take all. So the Philistines send their man. He's a well-known warrior by the name of Goliath of Gath. He is a man of enormous physical stature. 9 feet 6 inches tall. He wore a helmet of bronze so big you could use it for a house planter. His coat of metal weighed nearly 200 pounds. He is armed with a javelin to throw, a spear the size of a telephone pole designed to penetrate armor, and a sword for hand-to-hand combat to finish the job up close and personal. Now, a couple passages begin to create the dilemma of the story and the great conflict that's about to take place. We read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And in verse 16 we read, for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So here we find the record of a military crisis. Two great armies, battle lines are drawn, between them the Valley of Elah, a veritable no man's land, with a giant standing smack dab in the middle. And for 40 days, like clockwork, this giant comes out and thunders a challenge to the nation of Israel. Give me a man. 2 times a day, in the morning and the evening, for 40 days, 6 weeks. Is there anyone among you who has the courage or the heart to come and face me, winner take all? Giants are something bigger than us. They live inside of us. They live in the valleys of our fears. They stand before us and say, you're going to lose. You're going to take a beating. There are no familiar landmarks here. You're stepping out into the unknown. There's no firm footing. You don't know the outcome. The giants in our lives tell us, you're just going to stand there and wait for the knockout blow. It's coming. You know it is. As Winston Churchill said, fear makes cowards of us all. Well, the giant is shouting out this challenge, and Samuel says the people were afraid. And it's at this moment that the story takes a surprising turn. There is a shepherd boy from Bethlehem visiting his brothers. He's come to bring them some food from their father. And when he sees what's going on, he stares in disbelief. He looks around at the people of Israel and he concludes, how can you call yourselves soldiers, warriors, champions, and stand here and put up with this? Not only is this man humiliating Saul, our king, and you, our soldiers, he is humiliating our nation, and he is insulting our God. How can you put up with this? Now remember, David wasn't a soldier. He wasn't old enough to fight. He didn't belong there. He just knew that someone was messing with God. And then he does something crazy. He says, I'll fight the giant. I'll go into the valley. The honor of our nation and of our God is at stake. I'll take him on. You see, David knew that the root cause of fear at its core was a lack of trust in the character and nature and sovereignty of God himself. He knew that God wants us to live on the plus side of fear and trust in him no matter what. He understood and concluded either God is in control or he isn't. And he knew inside him, in his inner core, that God wants us to place our trust and our faith in him. That God wants to use our faith to overcome our fears. Overcoming our fears. Faith fights and overcomes fear. And here is how he did it. So how does faith overcome fear in David's life? First, faith has a spiritual history to it. We read in chapter 17, verse 37, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. He says to Saul, when he goes to tell Saul that he'll fight the giant, he said to him, I have fought lions. I have fought bears. I have been living out there in the desert all of my life, watching over my sheep. Just me and God. And God has proven over and over and over again that he can be trusted. I have seen God at work in my life. My faith has a spiritual history to it. So that when the time came for David's faith to be tested, he could confidently appeal to the deep reality of the time-tested faith within him. You see, faith is not dependent on the size or the power or the strength of the giant or the size of the odds. Faith is dependent upon the spiritual activity of God in our lives. David can be confident because God had been active in his life. He had a spiritual history. He was already sure that God could be trusted. When giants step into our lives, Saul the king says, look at the size of the giant. David the shepherd boy says, look at the power of God. And in this context, for me, when I understand what David's talking about with the spiritual history and how important it is for us to understand that, I make a list of spiritual milestones. I've been keeping this list for 40 years now. For you, you might want to just do it over the last 10 years of your life. Carve out some time, to understand your spiritual history. Where has God been faithful in our lives? Where has he been faithful to you? Now, that doesn't mean that he answered our prayers the way you or I wanted them answered. It means God may have answered them in a different way, which was far better than our limited, finite perspective, which was the root of our prayers. He looks from an eternal, absolute perspective. So he always knows what the best answer is for your prayers and mine. So when we've been facing those giants, when we've been up to our eyeballs in fear, where has God delivered us? Where do we find a faith that can already be trusted in our spiritual history? Make your list. Well, there's something else. Not only does faith have a spiritual history to it, but faith has a spiritual identity to it. Listen to what David says in chapter 17, verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of bronze on his head, and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Saul tries to put the armor of a soldier, of a warrior, of a champion on David. A helmet of bronze and a coat of mail and a big sword. This is Saul's way of fighting, but it's not David's way. It's not God's way for David. David could hardly move in someone else's armor. This isn't me. It's not me. I can't go in these things. I haven't used them. I'm not a soldier. I'm a shepherd. This is your suit, not mine. This is your way, not my way. I don't fit into someone else's armor. You see, there were three kinds of soldiers in an ancient army. There were the bowmen. They could shoot an arrow up to a range of 150 yards. There were the infantry. They had heavy armor, shields, and swords for hand-to-hand combat. And then there were what they called the slingers. They were the key to the battle. They had a leather pouch and a rope and some stones. We find slingers throughout history. In 2500 BC, we find slingers in the epic battle between Egypt and Assyria. In 400 BC, Homer tells us about the Greek infantry that suffered severely from the Persian slingers because the Greek army couldn't reach the slingers of the Persians. We find slingers mentioned over and over again in the Bible. In 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 2, we read, they were bowmen and could shoot arrows, and there were slingers who could sling stones with either the right or the left hand. And we read in Judges chapter 20, verse 16, among all these were 700 picked men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. That was written in 1000 BC. The slingers, they would throw underhand like a softball pitcher. They'd whip that sling in wider and wider circles, faster and faster and faster. Then they'd take a step and hurl a rock the size of a golf ball at a target. Interestingly, the Israeli army estimates that the velocity of a single stone is similar to a .45 caliber bullet. It could kill at 100 yards. Experienced slingers, they say, could hit a bird in full flight. David saw himself as God saw him. His identity was in God himself. He understood, and I want you to catch this, that God had carefully been preparing him as a shepherd boy to fight giants. While he was guarding sheep, God was protecting him, and God was leading and guiding and preparing him. He was a shepherd, and shepherds were slingers. He didn't try to be someone else. He didn't wear someone else's armor. God had made him special and unique. He was a slinger. He had a personal spiritual identity about him. Which leads me to ask, who am I? How has God prepared me for the present moment? What gifts has God given uniquely to me? What training do I have that has given me certain strengths to be able to do battle for him, to be able to fight my fears and overcome my giants? David never lost sight of the power that God had given him in his training. I know who I am. I know where I came from. I am a shepherd. I am a slinger. Faith has a spiritual history. It has a spiritual identity to it. And faith has a spiritual abandonment to it. I love this passage, chapter 17, verse 48. When the Philistines arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. Did you catch that? David ran quickly toward the giant. Complete abandonment. A giant with 200 pounds of armor designed for close-range combat can't move. He's immobilized. His strength is a liability to him. Giants never have a chance against a slinger. Slingers beat the giants every single time. We don't fear our giants. God says run towards them. Faith does something. It is an action. Noah preached a sermon on faith for 125 years with a hammer and a saw before a single drop of rain ever fell. Faith is an action. The Bible does not consider a faith known until it is a faith experienced. Faith says, don't run away from the giant, no matter how big or no matter how powerful. Run towards him. Because faith always overcomes fear. So overcoming has a spiritual history to it. God's protected me in the past. I have spiritual milestones. It's important for me to go back and review my spiritual story, and I want you to do that. List the milestones where God has been faithful to you and to me in our past. Keep that list. It's the record of God's faithfulness that we can lean on when the next giant comes our way. And faith has a spiritual identity to it. God made us uniquely special. He's given us certain gifts and strengths that we can use. Where has God prepared me for this moment in my life, for this giant in my life? God has been at work preparing me. I may not have understood it. I may have thought I was only tending to the sheep, but God has prepared me to face giants in my life. He has given me a unique, special identity. I don't want to be anyone else but me. God has prepared me. And faith has a spiritual abandonment to it. How do you get on the plus side of fear? I know this isn't an easy one. I know this is hard. I know it's even scary to say. But there's that moment when we cross the line of faith, and rather than running away from our fears, we turn and we run towards them. And it's in running towards them in spiritual abandonment that God overcomes the fears in our lives. So may God bless all of us richly as we face the giants of our lives through faith, which overcomes our fears.